Okay, there we go, officially. My name is Anna Koens. I'm Impact and Outreach Manager for Earth Investigations Problem at Journalism Fund Europe. And that is a large grant program with which we're trying to increase capacity for environmental investigations and environmental journalists. And we thought that one of the obvious issues to look in Europe is all the lobby and all the behind the scenes of the environmental issues and the Green Deal and Farm to Fork and all the initiatives. And we already supported several projects that looked into lobby issues, and more are on the way. We just had a round of applications closed last month, a couple of weeks ago, and only there were 2 more proposals that looked into the lobbying in the environmental area. So I think that should be quite helpful to be able to learn from our distinguished experts and be able to ask them questions as well. So I'm very happy to have here with us today Nina Holland and Vicky Hann. Nina Holland is a researcher and campaigner of Corporate Europe Observatory, focused on the agribusiness lobby in the field of pesticides and genetically modified products, among others. And Vicky Hann has worked with the Corporate Europe Observatory since 2011, mostly on lobby transparency, revolving doors, conflicts of interest, and corporate capture of the institutions, including the Council of Europe. And recently, she moved more onto chemicals policy and campaigns. And I think that if any of the attendees are planning to explore this subject, I hope you can ask your questions directly. So we'll divide the webinar in 2 parts, and we'll have a Q&A and an opportunity for a discussion after each part. And I would love to give floor to Nina now to start with the introduction of what Corporate Europe Observatory has been doing.
Thank you very much, Anna. Can you hear me well?
Yes,
great. I'll start sharing my screen. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I have been working also with Corporate Europe Observatory for quite a while on different themes, but in the last 10 years on agribusiness lobbying, food and agriculture, and increasingly environmental topics. So for those who don't know CEO very well, we were founded in 1997. And in the wake of the also globalization movement, so we are a lobby watchdog, we are a research organization, but we are also a campaigning organization. So we do work that actually is in many ways quite similar to investigative journalism. But the campaigning part, the political part, is of course what makes us different from journalism. However, we work a lot with different media, both with investigative journalists, but also with reporters. So we try to get, of course, the widest possible outreach for our research. We work in different themes. We work on climate, on economy and finance. We work on big tech. We work sometimes on tobacco lobbying. So we have different themes, and we try to work with media as much as possible to get our research out at different levels, at the EU level, at national level as well. So that is really key to our work, to work with media that is interested in our topics. CEO was founded really from the realization that big corporations in that time, mainly European multinational organizations, multinational corporations, were very influential from the start in the building of the EU institutions and how they operated. So in that time, you had before each summit, before each EU summit, you had an exclusive meeting between CEOs of those corporations like Philips and Siemens with the heads of state of the key countries forming the EU, and basically presenting them with a wish list of what they thought the EU should be discussing and how the EU should be formed. And that is still what we do today. We're still very focused on the EU institutions, but we also have work at other levels like the UN. Very obviously, the industry has big budgets to allocate to lobbying, to wielding political power at different levels. For that, we have the EU Transparency Register, about which Vicky will tell you a lot more later on. And the figures that you can get from there are already very impressive. But even so, they are self-declarations by the industry. So in some cases, we have found evidence that the real figures are much, much higher. If we look at CEFIC, for instance, which is the trade association for the chemical industry, their total annual budget is over 40 million a year. And of that, they declare that they spend on lobbying 10 million. But the real figures are probably much higher. And this visual also shows that we need to pay attention when investigating lobbying, to not only look, of course, for the lobbyists of the multinationals, but also of their lobby groups. And each of these corporations are member of various lobby groups. And in this visual, you can see a very small example of that. So corporations like Bayer or BASF, they will be member of CEFIC, but they will also be member of Plastics Europe. They will also be member of the pesticide lobby group, CropLife Europe, or VCI, the German lobby group on chemicals. They have a host of other lobby actors to their disposal because they have big budgets, and those are lobby consultancies, law firms, corporate-sponsored think tanks that are present in the hundreds here in Brussels. So in these few square kilometers, you have really an ecosystem, an environment of lobby actors that can jump in on a lobby campaign at any given moment, that can give their specific expertise, and who can play a really key role, because specifically those lobby consultancies are often key in one of the lobby strategies, which is the revolving doors. So they are very good in hiring previous high-level decision makers from the EU bubble, who are very good in opening the doors to decision makers for the clients of these corporations, the clients of these lobby consultancies. So it's important to look at these actors and this structure. So the lobby is very well organized. I always say, BASF and Bayer might be competitors in the economic sphere, but they are really colleagues in the political sphere. They really have the same interests, and therefore they collaborate in these lobby groups. And the same is replicated at the national level. When you are writing for a national media outlet and you do your research, you will easily find the members of CropLife, of CEFIC, of Plastics Europe. You will find that they have members in each member state. And so the same structure is replicated. If we broadly go to some key lobby strategies, this is a good visual made by BASF that shows how they really like to start very early in the forming of the ideas. It is much more effective for them and efficient to intervene in a very early stage of decision making rather than only at the end when a proposal has already been made. So the graph is basically stating that the earlier you intervene on the left in the non-paper phase, so to say, the more effect you can have to basically tweak or even block or weaken a certain new type of legislation. There are many lobby strategies and tools. The toolbox is very large and very sophisticated. One example is, as I just said, if you want to get involved early, you make sure that you participate in the Commission's expert and advisory groups. Some of these groups are even dominated by industry lobbyists. You can also lobby through science by, for instance, financing certain studies. The revolving doors, so hiring former politicians or decision makers. Of course, there are many, many meetings and events, the more traditional lobby activities that often take place here in Brussels or in the national capitals. Then there are other strategies that are part of building the lobby campaigns and the narrative, the arguments. One of them that is very important that I'll discuss a bit more in detail is the impact assessment. It's that this is a a policy tool, but it's also something that is replicated by industry to show how much loss will be suffered by their sector from new regulation for environment and health. Then there are other very quite opaque lobby strategies, such as setting up certain government departments or commission departments against the other. And in this way, for instance, DG Environment in Brussels got very much under attack and marginalized compared to DG Industry or DG Trade, for instance. So the lobby really targeted those DGs that they expected would help them to sideline other DGs like DG Environment. And one of the most opaque strategies I found is that lobby groups like an industry-linked plant science organization would actually set up a range of meetings of national officials that they expected would be friendly to them and to their deregulation proposal. In this case, it was about seeds and GMOs. And they had a range of meetings, even set up a mailing list, trying to organize a critical mass of national officials in order to prepare a favorable council position. Council is, of course, the institution where the member states are sitting. And then there is also an important one is the echo chamber, which industry needs in order to create more legitimacy. So they need other voices from other actors in society to say what they say, to make it more legitimate. Well, I think hardly need to say why pesticides and chemicals are a key topic. When we talk about planetary boundaries, the chemical pollution, which you see on the top to the right, is one of the planetary boundaries of which we have most evidence that it's already been surpassed, and to cost of ecosystem functioning, at cost of course human health, but also of food security. So when 4 years ago, when entering of the new commission, the von der Leyen Commission, they announced a Green Deal in the area of food and agriculture and chemicals, there were actually some really good proposals, which really put industry for maybe the first time in a long time on the defense. And these included reduction targets of antibiotics, fertilizers, and pesticides, but also a ban on PFAS, a ban on the export of chemicals and pesticides that are already banned in the EU, which is still happening today, and a host of other laws that would really change farming and would really do something to restore biodiversity. However, right in the beginning, already one blockade was constructed, and that was that at the same time, the farm subsidy program, the CAP, was being negotiated, and the mainstream farm union, the industrial farm union, Copa-Cogeca, with their traditional allies in the center-right party, the EPP, was very effective in lobbying the status quo, as they are always effective in doing. In this agricultural policymaking sphere, they really dominate that. And they basically made sure that farmers will not be paid for this transition. So the policy goals of the farm to fork were not translated in the farm subsidies, which basically means you tell farmers to do new things, but you don't pay them for it. And since they are already in a difficult situation, the seed for the farmers' protest that we've seen in the last months was already sown in that time. We did a specific article. We tried to really scratch into the power of Copa-Cogeca. They really dominate many expert groups in DG Agriculture. They have privileged access. Just before each council meeting, they have a privileged meeting that nobody else has with the national ministers of agriculture. But they really only defend the farmers' interest of, let's say, the 20% biggest farmers. And this is shown, for instance, by the fact that they defend the unfair distribution of the farm subsidies, in which 80% of the money goes to only 20% of the recipients, and many of those are big landowners. So when the Commission finally made or was announcing to be working on this pesticide reduction proposal, 50% reduction. That is, according to us, it was not enough, but of course it is very substantial and would have quite some impact on farmers having to change methods. And what Corporate did is they collaborated with CropLife Europe, with the pesticide industry, and they both, and a few other agribusiness lobby groups did the same. They all commissioned impact studies from consultancies or universities. In the case of Corporate, they went to Wageningen University in the Netherlands, who have a privatized part and a public part. The privatized part works like a consultancy. You can just basically order a study. Of course, these studies were very misleading because of the questions they asked. They asked, what will happen if you reduce pesticides, fertilizer right now, and you don't implement any other method to combat pests? Well, obviously, your predicted harvests will go down, productivity will go down, and that was the message. At the same time, we had the COVID crisis, the breaking out of the Ukraine war. And so this message of threatened food security proved extremely effective in this situation. So we were lucky enough in that time to have 2 leaks of a Corporate strategy, an internal one, and an internal lobby strategy of CropLife Europe. And precisely so we could see how their campaigns were linked and how the publication of these studies, as you can see in the red button in the middle, was central to their lobby campaign. This is a slide from this leaked study from CropLife, and you will not be able to read it, but you can trust me, right on the top right of the slide, it says, amplify the Wageningen impact assessment to build surround sound and pressure. Surround sound is, of course, the echo chamber. And they organized in the same week, they organized 3 different events in October 21, presenting all these different impact studies, saying, look what these academics are saying, look what this university is saying, listen to the science, listen to what the data says. So it sounded very objective, but it was far from it. It was industry-funded studies with industry questions, directed questions. Why it has always been so very difficult to change anything in agricultural policies and make it more green is the structure of the farm lobby, their traditional strong connections with the EPP, with the Christian Democrat Party, that often dominate the national ministries, but also DG Agriculture. And in this slide, you see research done by Dismog on the ties of the chemical industry and the farm lobby on the left and the chemical industry on the right, with 6 key EPP members of parliament that were particularly active fighting the pesticide reduction target and the farm-to-fork strategy in general. And these include Herbert Dorfman, Anne Sander from France, Bogovic from Slovenia. And he himself, in fact, was selling pesticides for 16 years in Slovenia. And Sander, her brother, is very high up in the FNSCA, which is the member of Corporate in France, very powerful organization. So you can see that the fact that they had in these 3 key years of the negotiation of the pesticide reduction target, they had 400 meetings together with any of these groups that you see here. So this outnumbered any meeting with civil society or small farmers unions by 8 to 1. The EPP also radicalized. So when they realized that the Farmers' Party in the Netherlands basically wiped out the EPP party in the Netherlands, they really got more radically anti-environmental. So they tried to destroy the nature restoration law in June 23. And soon after, they targeted the pesticide reduction law as well, and basically completely defeated it. They weakened it so much that it became worse than the previous law. And that is why it was voted down by the entire parliament, even by socialists, because it became so bad that it was just not worth having anymore. So they all vocally, these 6 people and many others continued to repeat these really post-truth arguments of impacts, Ukraine war, all time and again. So even though it was exposed to be an industry strategy, they kept doing that. This impact strategy, of course, is not really new. It has been done for decades, but it's increasingly being done because it's in times of economic crisis and cost of living crisis. It's very effective to scaremonger decision makers and parts of society. For instance, Cefic, they did another impact study, basically scaremongering decision makers with job losses, economic losses, and that is part of the reason why we still don't have a REACH revision, because of this scaremongering of what the chemicals strategy for sustainability would do. So the same strategy was repeated on chemicals, on pesticides, but also on animal health. Animal welfare, for instance, that was also a promised legislation with big civil society support, with citizen support. Millions of citizens supported European citizens' initiatives, these official EU petitions in these areas of pesticides and animal welfare, and nothing has been delivered thanks to this lobbying. We arrive at the most recent episode this winter when farmers' protests were hitting many areas in Europe and especially also Brussels. And this is a picture where actually many of us were somewhere down in this square because the leading organization here was Via Campesina, and they joined the farmers' protests because they represent farmers, and many of their members are in a very dire economic situation. And so they decided to join but change the message. And the main message was stop the free trade agreements, introduce market regulation in order for farmers to have a fair price. These have always been Via Campesina's demands. However, the dominant political translation and the dominant message in the media was this: farmers protest against the EU's Green Deal. Of course, some farmers and Copa-Cogeca definitely had this message as well, but it cannot be seen separate from the socio-economic situation of many farmers that they've been pushed into due to basically being delivered to a free market where, for instance, the low wheat prices make it hardly profitable, make it impossible to make a living from producing this key crop. So that is what we have been seeing in the last 4 years. Of course, things will not get easier. We will have elections, and the predictions are not favorable to a new Green Deal. We have seen that the ECIs, the European Citizens' Initiatives, have not been met, that some of the promises like pesticide reduction have completely failed, that other initiatives like the Sustainable Food Systems Law or the REACH revision have simply disappeared or have been delayed. We also still do not even have a ban on the export of banned chemicals and pesticides. We should realize that these corporations still make up to 1/3 of their profits in the field of pesticides from the highly hazardous category 1. So they are not at all intending to go to a more sustainable model or to move to biocontrol methods or whatever. They still produce highly toxic substances in the EU and export that to the rest of the world. And in fact, next week we will launch a new investigation into their lobby arguments to keep doing that. So the corporations' own arguments, why they are saying that they should still be allowed to export paraquat, neonicotinoids, or atrazine around the world, with, of course, heavy health consequences for the communities and people living around the big monoculture plantations, for instance, in Brazil, producing, again, like soy for the European market. What CEO, of course, will also be doing is to scrutinize after the elections the new MEPs, especially those in powerful positions, committee chairs, but also the new commissioners relevant in this field, and basically all the new commissioners for their backgrounds and conflicts of interest. And we have already prepared a guide for new MEPs to warn them for corporate capture, how it works and how they can recognize it. So these are some of the things that we will be doing in the next month. And Vicky will now take over to add one more element of how industry is trying to shift the agenda firmly away from the EU Green Deal.
Thanks, Nina, and hi, everybody, and I hope you can hear me okay. As Nina says, we're in the run-up to the EU elections now, and of course, industry doesn't have a vote, but is very keen on having a say and trying to set the agenda. And so I want to spend the last couple of minutes on this part of our webinar talking about something called the Antwerp Declaration. And this was launched by Cefic. You've heard about Cefic from Nina and the wider chemicals industry. So really the biggest polluters and the biggest energy users in Europe. You can read more about it on this link, but it was launched in February at a private event that was hosted by Prime Minister De Croo as part of the Belgian presidency of the EU. President von der Leyen from the Commission was there. And it has really enjoyed a lot of support, I must say, amongst corporate supporters. They've gone from 70 on the day to about 1,100 now. And it's part of what I would say is a common push across big industry in the run-up to the elections. Really, I think building on what they have seen with the Green Deal, they've managed to manipulate parts of the Green Deal to suit them, particularly on the climate areas. They've managed to dismiss parts of the Green Deal that they really didn't like, which was the parts that Nina has been talking about on chemicals and on pesticides. And now they are pushing forward with a much more, or an even more offensive agenda, I would say, and one that fits, as I say, with what wider industry wants, but which also I think fits with the wider direction of travel that the EU is unfortunately taking us in. So here you see this is the Antwerp Declaration. It's not actually that many words, but it's really important, I think, to be probing and to be a bit careful about what it means, because I think you could read it and think, oh, that doesn't sound too bad, but actually I think we need to interrogate it quite carefully, and the next couple of slides attempt to do that. A big part of the this Antwerp Declaration is that they want an industrial deal to complement the Green Deal. But of course, we know what's happened to the Green Deal. A lot of the positive Green Deal ambitions have already been destroyed. So already we can start to be cynical about industry agenda on this. And I think, and we'll share these slides with you afterwards, and there's not time to go through our whole analysis here. But I think one of the most problematic things that the industrial deal does is that it is it really tries to make a hierarchy of the different crises. So we always talk about the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the pollution crisis, the triple crises affecting our environment. But in fact, industry is prioritizing the climate crisis, but in a way which is really problematic, because they are going for these false solutions that have been, I think, locked in to EU policy most recently. These include things like carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, even nuclear is on there. And meanwhile, the work on pollution and biodiversity has really been lost. And a key demand that industry is after is about more public money. If you want us to invest in, say, green energy, if you want us to even remotely consider investing in sustainable substances, moving away from hazardous substances, then you need to publicly fund us, which I think is pretty outrageous. And so this is really an agenda which I think is very much about skewing the economy towards the needs of big business, and of course there's a lot there's a lot in the Antwerp Declaration which needs unpicking, but of course there's no mention of the toxic pollution crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the polluter pays principle, the precautionary principle. None of this is in there. And really there's no reflection either about the decades of corporate lobbying which we have seen, which has managed to undermine public interest legislation, public interest regulation on health and environmental issues. And so when we're faced with this level of lobbying that Nina has outlined, and which I think it will continue certainly in the next commission, we need to think, or as civil society, I think we are starting to think about what are new approaches to tackle corporate lobby influences, because we've had, as Nina has outlined, years, decades even of scaremongering, of lobbying to undermine public interest regulation, and actually they've been successful because the laws that we do have in place haven't stopped the ongoing pollution, and there are many loopholes. Regulation can be very slow to get toxic products off the market, and it's really, I think the situation is such that we really need a different approach to controlling and tackling this corporate lobby influence. We're very inspired by the example of the tobacco industry, where at the World Health Organization, actually the anti-tobacco campaigners worked with the World Health Organization to start to exclude the tobacco industry from public health regulation. And there are now rules in place that the tobacco industry at global and national levels shouldn't be influencing decision makers when they are exploring public health rules, because of course the tobacco industry has nothing sensible to say about public health. And colleagues that work on the climate crisis are increasingly taking that model to the UN climate talks and at the EU and national levels as well, to say, again, fossil fuel companies have nothing meaningful to add to solutions to the climate crisis, and we need to find new ways of making policy where they are not part of the decision making, they are not around the table. That doesn't mean corporations aren't consulted at all. Of course, they need to be consulted, but they shouldn't get privileged access. They shouldn't get private meetings. They shouldn't be sharing lobby platforms. And we should all be more lobby platforms with decision makers. And we should all be far more aware of what their agenda really is. And so we think this is really, these are inspiring examples. And we are increasingly think, how can we apply this to toxic polluters like the ones that Nina has been talking about, pesticide producers, hazardous substances producers, and can we start to learn the lessons from tobacco and increasingly from fossil fuels? So I'm going to stop there, and I think we can pause for a bit of a question and answer session, and then we'll pick things up again. So I hand over to Anna.
All right. Yes. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand so I could enable your microphone, or you could type it here. Okay. Right. So there is a question from Georgia. Georgia Michalopoulos says, investigates greenwashing in European financial markets following SFDR regulation. George is asking if you can point to some tools to monitor lobbying practices by global financial institutions on the still weak sustainable finance policies of the European Commission.
I can take that one. After this Q&A, we will look at some lobby tools. When you say the global financial institutions, do you mean corporations or do you mean the things like the World Bank and the IMF? I'm not sure, but certainly in the next part of this webinar, we'll be looking at lobby tools to expose lobbying by corporations and sharing some of the techniques and the tactics that we use as Corporate Europe Observatory to investigate.
Yeah, I mean, private financial institutions, but participating to financial markets, banks, asset managers, and so forth. Also associations, right? As you mentioned, there are.
Yes, so we will cover that in the next session.
Okay, thank you.
So hang on for 5 minutes.
Of course.
All right. Any other questions at this point? If not, maybe I could ask one, because I was wondering about that part where you were talking about the internal leaks that help you see how the campaigns were led and matched and kind of shared a common goal. Do you think it is doable for journalists to get an access to the same leaks? Like, what kind of relationship would it take? Whether it's only possible if you work on a topic for a long time, for example, or it's a matter of, you know, of a smart introduction and somebody who introduces you as a trustworthy journalist who would not disclose sources and stuff.
That's a very good question. It was very fortunate that we got them, and of course we don't always have them. So when you work at the Brussels level, there are many organizations that talk all the time. You know, it's also you meet a lot of people in the different events, and sometimes even in lobby organizations there are people who think that something is going too far, or they are no longer interested to work in this lobby group, for instance, and then they'll leak it to someone who will then pass it on to us because they know that this is what we do. So it is very much who you know, and of course at the national level you can build up those relationships, so it pays off over time, I think. But of course, in many other cases, we don't have them, and we are relying on freedom of information requests. So that's also internal information that also tells you loads, and of course on things like what the industry answers to public consultations. You know, so there are really also without the leaks, it is possible to get a wealth of lobby evidence, which is in the end, you know, what you need.
Just to add to that, we have thought in the past of setting up a lobby Dropbox, so where we could proactively seek leaks, and our colleagues who work on big tech, together with a couple of other organizations, have set up a lobby leaks platform, which is secure, and that they have received some lobby documents, particularly this is with a particular focus on big tech lobbies. But yeah, they are a bit of the holy grail, I guess, in terms of understanding what's going on either within the institutions or within lobby firms and consultancies and companies. But yeah, but it's there is lobby leaks, I think, if you would be interested to explore that a little bit more and just see how we go about it.
All right, great. So I'll ask another time if there are any questions at this point, and if not, I think, Vicky, we can proceed with the second part.
Okay, great. So I will share my screen. I hope you can see the slides again. So in the next session, we will look at tools and tips for exploring lobbying at the EU and indeed at the national level as well. And these are some of the tools that we will run through. Again, as I said, we will share these slides because I think a lot of information is going to come your way. I hope a lot of it is new to you, but forgive me if there's some overlap with what you already know. But I want to start off by talking about the EU Lobby Transparency Register, which Nina has already mentioned. It's the biggest lobby register in the world. In theory, anyone lobbying or trying to influence EU decision-making should be a member of the register, and in it you can find money spent on lobbying or the numbers of lobbyists being employed by particular organizations. You can find information on topics and on meetings declared by either commissioners or MEPs, and there's a link to the register there. What I will particularly focus on today is our own platform, which is called LobbyFacts. And this is a project of us, Corporate Europe Observatory, but also the German lobby watchdog, Lobby Control. And as LobbyFacts, we take the data from the EU Lobby Register and we make it much more user-friendly. And the crucial added value that LobbyFacts has over the EU Lobby Register, and we'll look at all of this in a minute, but our real added value is that we have collected lobby data since 2012. And so while the EU register will just show you the current registrations of all the lobbyists registered, actually we can show you all of their archive since 2012. And on LobbyFacts, you can perform various searches, which I will show you in a minute. And as I said, the emphasis is really on making it a user-friendly tool, particularly for journalists and for campaigners and students. But there are some problems with the EU Lobby Register, and unfortunately those problems also affect LobbyFacts, because LobbyFacts is entirely based on the data in the EU Lobby Register. And the key problem with the EU Lobby Register is that it is a voluntary register. It is not legally binding on lobbyists. And so that means that there are quite the sanctions that the authorities have to ensure that everybody signs up can be quite weak. So in very quickly, that means that there are three problems with the data in the register. So the first one is that it is possible to lobby in Brussels and not be part of the lobby register. And we have some examples that we've exposed and we've campaigned on over time. If you are really determined not to be part of the register, not to be transparent, you can get away with it. So that is worth remembering when you are looking at the data. The second problem with the data is that it can be unreliable or sometimes even implausible. And I'll show you an example of this shortly. And that really comes from the fact that the data is self-declared largely. A few pieces of data come direct from the Parliament and come direct from the Commission, but otherwise the data is self-declared by the registrants themselves, and some make mistakes. But some, as Nina alluded to earlier, we think some lobbyists minimize their declarations rather than being as open and transparent as we think they should be. So there is a problem with reliability of some of the data. And just to give you an idea about that, a couple of years ago, we did a complaint to the Register Authority. There were about 12,000 entries in the register. We complained about 430 of them. And remarkably, we were told that of those 430 that we complained about, only 3% were correct. they had to ask 59% to update their registration, and 38% were removed. So there is an ongoing problem with tidying up the register and keeping on top of the poor data, and the register authorities are not resourced sufficiently to be able to do as many checks as we would like them to do. And then the third thing to say, and this is important for those of us that are journalists and wanting to tell stories, is that sometimes there's a bit of vague and inconsistent data. And again, I'll show you some examples of this. But if you are wanting to explore lobbying on a particular topic, say the sustainable use reduction of pesticides, you could put in that as a title for a piece of legislation, and you will not get so many answers. We have to think round it. We need to do a search for pesticides. We would perhaps need to do a search for the acronym. We might need to go a bit bigger and instead look for lobbying on farm to fork. These are some of the issues that we have with LobbyFacts. But nonetheless, and this is a really important message, despite the fact that there is imperfect data, there are some really good and interesting stories to be found in the lobby data available either on the register or particularly with LobbyFacts. And in the last few months, we've seen some of these stories and many more. The FT did a piece on chemicals last year using LobbyFacts. So there are good stories to be found. We just need to be aware of some of the problems with the data. So I'm now going to just take us to LobbyFacts and do a very quick tour around the site. And again, all the links will be in the presentations that we will share. So this is the homepage of LobbyFacts. And if you just move down a little bit, you get a number of searches that will really be the key way in which you will get into the nitty-gritty of the lobby data. So let's start with a really obvious one. You are interested in a particular organization. Let's look for Bayer, the big German chemicals producer, pesticides, farmer producer. And of course, Bayer is a not uncommon word appearing in German, but here we see Bayer AG, the company. So we click there and it takes you to the basic lobby card that LobbyFacts holds on Bayer. And you can use these to navigate through the text. If you're familiar with the EU Lobby Transparency Register, it's set out in a pretty similar way. At the top, you can see some of the most important details. So self-declared lobby costs, we can see they spend at least 8 million, up to 8 million a year. They say on lobbying, that's figures from last year. They have 76 different lobbyists, which equate to 26 or so full-time equivalents. They have a number of people with European parliamentary passes, so they can come and go. They've had a lot of meetings with the Commission. But to emphasize again that the value added of LobbyFacts is really this, which is the timeline of Bayer in the EU Lobby Register. So each of these triangles represents a moment when Bayer updated its registration. So if we click on one of these, we can see, we go back to 2020, we can see that actually then they were only declaring 4 million or so in lobby costs. So already that's very interesting. Why has Bayer, and we can investigate that more, massively increased its lobby spending over the years, and it's very likely that it is as a direct response to the publication of the Green Deal and what that has meant for them in terms of lobbying to oppose the provisions on pesticides. And this here, and there's one of these on each lobby data card, gives you the overview of Bayer's spending since we hold data for them, which in fact is back to 2010. So you can see there's a really clear increasing trajectory there. And that kind of information already gives you an opportunity to do these kind of stories. This is from a profile we did on BASF last year. You can see that we have their current spending, or as it was then, declared last year, but we can also come up with a spend from the past decade by looking at the different years spending. And in fact, we can also then look in aggregate at different corporations or trade associations at the top of the register. So we just looked at these top 7 in the register, the biggest lobbies from the toxic sector. And by using LobbyFacts, you can work out that actually they've spent the best part of 300 million lobbying the EU in 10 years. And of course, these are self-declared figures, so it may well be that the actual figures are much higher. So that's the very basic data card and the kind of information that you can find when you are looking for it. The next search is this one. This is particularly interesting if you are looking at a revolving doors case, or you are interested in spotting or tracking a lobbyist through their career. Just because we're a bit short of time, I will just put my own name in here. Here I am, Victoria Lucy Kann. You need to watch for that if you're searching for names. I call myself Vicky, but officially I have to be Victoria Lucy Kann. And you can see that I used to have a pass for, of course, my organization, Corporate Europe Observatory. And if we move down to lobbyists and we pull this drop down up, and then I do a search for Hann, you will see that I had a pass in 2013, 2014. If you're interested in tracking particular lobbyists and their careers, perhaps for a revolving door story, this would be quite a useful search for you. Another thing which is very useful is, particularly if you're exploring big corporations, is to look at who else is in their network, and in particular, who are their lobby consultancies and law firms, because almost all big companies and big trade associations will have lobby consultancies and law firms that are working with them on their lobbying. And if I just put in a quick example here, we have BASF, which we've looked at before. You can see that there are many iterations of BASF in the register. And again, this comes back to this sense that LobbyFacts can only use the data that is in the register, and organize, because the data is self-declared and it's not particularly checked or verified. It is free text. So there will be the same company may well appear in different ways. But if we just click on this top one, we can see that actually quite a few lobby firms have declared having BASF as a client. And in fact, if you go back to all of those and click through on all of those, I calculated, I think in this slide, that as of about this time last year, BASF had employed in the past 10 years at least 15 different lobby consultancies and law firms. And I think digging into the issues and how much was being spent on them can give you quite an interesting story again, and it gives you a more rounded picture of exactly how an organization is operating. And of course, within additional to that, you could also look at the trade associations as well. Often their members' names are automatically public on their website. They often publish members lists because they tend to be proud of them. And again, you can start to build up an idea of an organization's network. Then let's look quickly at topics that you might want to search for, particularly if you are searching on a particular a file, say. So as we said before, if you search for something very general, like climate policies, you will get over 3,000 results, which is far too many to really deal with, although you can download them and investigate a bit more. You can be a bit more precise and put in farm to fork and starts to narrow it down a bit. So there we get 797 results, and then you could go further, drill down a bit more into pesticides or whichever file you were particularly interested in, but worth using lots of different versions of the file name so that you can capture it, because there is no standardized way, unfortunately, for those putting in this data to register their interest in a particular file. It's free text, so you have to be a little bit careful, but nonetheless, there have been some good stories in the past about the numbers of organizations lobbying on particular files using the LobbyFacts tools. So you can download lots of searches, amalgamate them, get rid of the duplicates, and then you have the beginnings of a story. And then finally, on this part of the search, you can search for particular meetings that the high level of the Commission have had on particular topics. So if we put in a topic like REACH, the main chemicals legislation, you can see that actually we get 90 results here, and we can just have a quick look at the top one, say Business Europe, perhaps the most influential lobby in Brussels. We can click down here to the list of Commission meetings, and if we do another search for REACH, we will see that they've had a meeting in March 2022. Looks like they had another one the week before on REACH. And so for each of those 90 results, you could explore what the topics were, and then you could potentially put in a access to documents request, a freedom of information request to find out more about those meetings. And I'll talk about freedom of information in a minute. So those are some of the key searches that we have on LobbyFacts. But let me just show you one or two other things before we move on. So if we go to this Get Started tab, so below the searches that I've just shown you are another set of searches that you can do. And most of these are fairly self-explanatory, but there's one particular thing I'd like to show you. So you can pull out all the companies and groups if you were interested, or all trade associations, or all law firms, for example, if you were interested, by using this drop down here. If you are interested in lobbies that come from your country or another country, you can use this tab. You might be interested in lobbying on a particular date, so going back some time, you can use the calendar here. But before, I was talking about the problems of some problematic data or incorrect data, and we just have a little look at an example here, because this when you scroll down on the homepage of LobbyFacts, you get all the lobby data, and it's you can see it's synchronized with the register as of yesterday, 12,500 results. And you can see that they are ordered in size. So the biggest declaring lobbies appear at the top of the list. And if you look down on the left, you can see a lot of familiar names. This is Cefic, this one. Meta, of course, is Facebook. Microsoft, Bayer, Apple, Google, lots of big trade associations as well. For me, this looks like quite a plausible list of the biggest companies and organizations lobbying in Brussels. And also it looks pretty plausible here because they've got significant numbers of European Parliament access passes, which you would expect if they're spending 10 million on lobbying. And they've had meetings with the high level of the Commission. The numbers vary, but this looks a plausible list, generally speaking, except for this entry number 2 from Brazil, Veracel Cellulose. Don't know that company, but they've declared 10 million lobby costs. And remarkably, they have somebody who works only half a day a week for them, trying to spend 10 million a year on lobbying. It looks like they've had one meeting for the Commission, but they've got no European parliamentary access passes. And if we look on here, we will see that actually they only registered on the 4th of March. And I think their lobby meeting was on the 7th of March. I think you can only get a lobby meeting at that level if you were part of the register. So I hazard a guess that they joined very quickly to get their meeting with the Commission, and they made some mistakes. This is probably their turnover. It's probably not their lobby costs. But that's a fairly plausible story, I think, for me to tell you about that. And that unfortunately, the lobby register hasn't yet picked up on what I think is clearly a mistaken entry. But LobbyFacts can help you to get rid of some of these because and you can play around with these filters, but broadly speaking, if you are a big lobbyist, you will probably have European passes. You may well have had high-level meetings of the Commission, and you may well have a Belgian office. You can play around with these filters, and if we say, I would say European Parliament passes is probably the most reliable one right now, and then of course, that odd Brazilian entry has been removed, and now you get a list that is, I think, a bit more realistic and plausible. So LobbyFacts can help you by using those filters and playing around with them, seeing the different results that you get. It can help you to get rid of some of what we would call the problematic data or the dodgy data. But I'd like to now just take you back to the presentation, and we'll look at a couple of other tools. But before we do that, I will just show you, give you a couple of other tips on using LobbyFacts. As I've said, the searches can be downloaded, which I think is really useful. So you can do multiple searches, download them, merge them, and you have a more sophisticated data set. We do have some capacity for helping with particular data requests if you can't immediately get what you want yourself of LobbyFacts, so let me know. There is a lot more information about how to do things on LobbyFacts. I know I've run through this very quickly. There's a video and there's a how-to guide. If you're really looking at the data, check out the disclaimer because that will give you more information. If you publish using LobbyFacts, always let us know because we will always give that a push and try and amplify it on social media. And then another little tip is that Nina was talking about CEFIC declaring a budget of 40 million and only lobby costs of 10 million. Well, if you are interested in comparisons for other organizations that are based in Belgium, you can check out the National Bank of Belgium, and that can be very useful if you want to look at an overall organization's budget and then compare it with what LobbyFacts has in terms of the self-declared lobby spend. So we've talked a lot about the European Lobby Register and LobbyFacts, but in fact, and you may already know this, there are 15 member states that also have publicly accessible registers of lobbyists. They really vary. And this quote is from this briefing by Transparency International, which you can get here. They recommend in particular, or say that the most thorough registers are Finland, France, and Germany. And I haven't used all of these, but I've certainly used the French one, the German one, the Irish one, and they are worth looking at, because if you're thinking about a company like BASF or like Bayer, of course, they're active at the EU level. Of course, they're active in the German level as well. They're German companies, and on the German lobby register, you can find that they declare many millions of lobby spend in Germany as well. But they are also, well, certainly BASF is also active in France, for example. So the big companies will not just be active in their own home countries, of course, they will be active elsewhere. So you may be aware of a lobby register in your country, but you may not know that there are these other registers and that they may have useful information on the companies or the organizations that you are interested in. Also by Transparency International is another platform which is called IntegrityWatch. And again, I recommend this to you. IntegrityWatch is actually several different sites. There is an EU one which has some of the same information as LobbyFacts and the EU lobby register, but it also has more emphasis on the European Parliament and on MEPs. So if you are interested, particularly in MEPs, if you're interested in their declarations of interest or their meetings, then IntegrityWatch will really be a useful resource for you. At the national level, the different Transparency International chapters have set up their own national platforms, and each of these varies, but some of them have information about party political funding or about national MEP declarations of interest. So again, this is really worth looking at if you're interested in lobbying at a national and EU level, or tracking a particular company and how it's been active in different countries. We've spent a bit of time today mentioning freedom of information requests and access to documents, and I would really say that along with some of what we've already talked about in terms of lobby data, I would say that actually access to documents, which is what it's called at the EU level, freedom of information, is really the bread and butter tool for us at Corporate Europe Observatory. We put in a lot of different requests, there's not time to go into the detail now about what makes a good request. Possibly you're already well familiar with this, but for me, there's always a balancing act, because as journalists and as campaigners, we always want to capture as much information as we possibly can on a topic, but sometimes that can be, really, the more detailed the request, or the broader the request, the longer it takes to answer. And that it can also be very problematic if you're in a country like Germany where you have to pay for your requests. So I find it's a bit of a balancing act to get it right, to get the information that you're after, but in a way which is quite precise and targeted, so you don't lose time or money. But again, there are some good platforms that can help you with this. And they're based on this software called Alavatelli, and you can find all of these different sites at this link here. And in particular, there is an EU platform as well. So these sites enable you to table freedom of information requests to particular authorities. At the EU level, you can table to all the different directorates general in the Commission, to the Parliament, to the executive agencies like the Chemicals Agency, the agency, or the Food Safety Authority. And what I find these platforms are really helpful for is keeping your requests organized. I've asked over 500 requests myself in my time. I expect Nina has as well. And these platforms can be very helpful because it just helps you to keep organized and also to see what others have asked. And if you are asking freedom of information requests at the EU level, it's definitely worth looking at the Ask the EU site and approaching the organisers for pro accounts. for journalists, and they can often be, I think they will do them for free, particularly if you're freelance, because that enables you to put in private requests, and you can then choose when they are made public. And it's good to make the requests public ultimately, because this is public information about lobbying or whatever's happening in the institutions. But in the run up to printing a story, you may well want to keep your good information to yourself. And you can also table batch requests there, which is really useful if you are wanting to table the same request to multiple agencies or commission directorates general. And then just a few tips, and then I will wrap up and we could go to questions. I can't be precise about this, but I would say that in about 80% of the times that I don't get what I want in the first round of a freedom of information request, and then I make an appeal. Probably in 80% of those times when I appeal, I get more information at appeal stage. So it can be a bit more work to make appeals, but if you don't get what you want, I always urge you to appeal. You have to be careful about deadlines, but I think my experience is not uncommon. I spoke with a journalist last year at a webinar on freedom of information, and he said his figure was possibly even higher than that. So it's really worth appealing if you don't get what you want. It's really important to be organized with these requests. That's why the platforms help. But I find that if you're putting in lots of requests, they can very easily, you can forget about them, or the authorities can very easily, conveniently forget about them. So you need to be really organized. And then if they really haven't worked, if your appeals haven't really worked and you think there's more information out there, there's a couple of tips that I would share, and they both require the help of friendly members of parliament, either at the national level or at the EU level. I have found that freedom of information requests tabled by friendly MPs can sometimes deliver better results than me asking as myself. Maybe that was just lucky, or maybe they do take them more seriously when they come from friendly, when they come from MPs and people with a higher profile. But there have been some really good stories that have come out of freedom of information requests that have been tabled by friendly MPs and who have then passed the information to civil society. So that is definitely worth thinking about, I think. And also parliamentary questions are also worth asking about. I've had examples, for example, in Germany, where I have asked for a list of meetings via freedom of information on a particular topic, and the authority has refused. But then an MP has asked via a parliamentary question, and actually they have managed to get that information. The problem is that it's then on the record, it's in the parliamentary record, so it then becomes public, so everybody could use that information. But actually that's a small price to pay, I would say, because then you could then do a follow-up lobby access to documents, freedom of information request to ask about the detail that was provided by the answer to the parliamentary question. So if freedom of information isn't working for you, those are some tips. And then the final thing that I would suggest, particularly if you're from Germany or Austria, again, it requires a friendly MP, but actually if you're exploring decision-making at the EU level via your national government, in Germany and Austria, there are some very good databases of information that is being held. So every time the German officials in Belgium, in Brussels, attend a meeting on a particular topic, they then send a message, a note of that meeting back to Berlin, and that goes into this database. And that is information that we can't directly access, but friendly MPs can, and their assistants can go in and look for interesting documents. And again, we've had some good stories and some good information from that route. You have to be careful. We're not supposed to have those documents. There's metadata on them, I think. but it is a way of getting some information that you can then maybe triangulate and confirm from other sources. But particularly if you're from Germany or Austria, that is I think maybe something to explore. That's my details. I should quickly add in Nina's into the chat, but I will stop sharing now and hand back to Anna.
Thank you very much, Vicky. I think this was a treasure trove of insights and helpful tips, quite practical ones. So I'd like to open the question and answers panel. Again, you can just type a question, or you could also raise a hand and then I can unmute you, whatever works better for you. I think, yeah, okay. Thank you, Vicky, for the contact. Yes, but I'm wondering if we have any specific questions. And if not, we could, I guess, just wrap up. I think this was really, really helpful, and we'll share it with some of our other grantees working on investigating lobby. And I think there is a lot of work, you know, for you for all the investigative journalists to do, and for Corporate Europe Observatory to keep doing. And, you know, thanks for everything you digged out so far. I will then share your presentation slides by email with the attendees, and I'm looking forward to everything that can be uncovered using LobbyFacts, IntegrityWatch, and all the other platforms. Thanks so much.
Don't hesitate to get in touch, and we'll be happy to give you more details or to work with you if you are interested in a similar topic that we cover.
Definitely. Thanks a lot.
And thanks for inviting us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.